Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. Mark Davis was a 23-year-old law student living in a small college town in Texas. He had always struggled, balancing the weight of his father's debts with the constant pressure to succeed. But despite the constant battles, he was determined to make something of himself. Mark had no time for anything but his studies and his part-time job. Every day felt like a mountain to climb, and the fear of failure never left his mind. He had nothing left to lose, or so he thought. One day, Mark received a phone call that would change everything. A voice on the other end was calm and authoritative, offering him a deal he could hardly believe. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Mark frowned. He didn't know anyone by that name. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he asked, confusion filling his voice. "I know enough," the voice replied, smooth and unbothered. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7:00 p.m. It's important." The line went dead before Mark could respond. He sat in silence for a moment, unsure if he had imagined the entire conversation. But with no other options and a growing sense of desperation, he decided to go. The rain was coming down in sheets as Mark walked into the cozy bistro later that evening. It was warm inside, with the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished wood floors. As he stepped in, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and fine wine surrounded him. Eleanor was already there, sitting at a corner table, her sharp eyes watching him as he walked over. "Mark," she greeted him, her voice cool and controlled. "I'm glad you could make it." He hesitated for a moment before taking a seat across from her. "I'm not sure why I'm here," he admitted, his voice low, almost reluctant. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You'll understand soon enough." She didn't waste time. With a smooth, almost practiced tone, she laid out the proposition that would alter Mark's life forever. "I know about your debts," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "And I know how hard it's been for you to keep up. I'm here to offer you a solution. Marry me, Mark." Mark blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, half laughing in disbelief. Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. "This isn't about romance," she explained calmly. "It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you'll be my husband. There will be no love involved, just a contract. You'll have everything you need, no questions asked." Mark stared at her, the weight of her words settling into his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know you." "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this," she said, her eyes cold and calculating. "You're exactly the kind of person I need." Mark's mind raced. He had heard of Eleanor Brooks before, but only in whispers. She was a woman of immense wealth and power, but this was something entirely different. He could pay off his father's debts, secure a future for himself and his mother, but at what cost? "I need time to think," he finally said, standing up and pushing his chair back. Eleanor nodded, unfazed. "Of course, take all the time you need. But don't take too long. This offer won't last forever." Mark walked out of the bistro, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to think, but deep down, he knew he was running out of options. He could hardly deny that the idea of financial security was tempting, but marrying a stranger, was it worth the price? Little did Mark know, this offer would lead him down a path that would not only change his financial future but also challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and himself. Now, let's get back to our story. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. Mark Davis was a 23-year-old law student living in a small college town in Texas. He had always struggled, balancing the weight of his father's debts with the constant pressure to succeed. But despite the constant battles, he was determined to make something of himself. Mark had no time for anything but his studies and his part-time job. Every day felt like a mountain to climb, and the fear of failure never left his mind. He had nothing left to lose, or so he thought. One day, Mark received a phone call that would change everything. A voice on the other end was calm and authoritative, offering him a deal he could hardly believe. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Mark frowned. He didn't know anyone by that name. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he asked, confusion filling his voice. "I know enough," the voice replied, smooth and unbothered. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7:00 p.m. It's important." The line went dead before Mark could respond. He sat in silence for a moment, unsure if he had imagined the entire conversation. But with no other options and a growing sense of desperation, he decided to go. The rain was coming down in sheets as Mark walked into the cozy bistro later that evening. It was warm inside, with the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished wood floors. As he stepped in, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and fine wine surrounded him. Eleanor was already there, sitting at a corner table, her sharp eyes watching him as he walked over. "Mark," she greeted him, her voice cool and controlled. "I'm glad you could make it." He hesitated for a moment before taking a seat across from her. "I'm not sure why I'm here," he admitted, his voice low, almost reluctant. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You'll understand soon enough." She didn't waste time. With a smooth, almost practiced tone, she laid out the proposition that would alter Mark's life forever. "I know about your debts," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "And I know how hard it's been for you to keep up. I'm here to offer you a solution. Marry me, Mark." Mark blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, half laughing in disbelief. Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. "This isn't about romance," she explained calmly. "It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you'll be my husband. There will be no love involved, just a contract. You'll have everything you need, no questions asked." Mark stared at her, the weight of her words settling into his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know you." "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this," she said, her eyes cold and calculating. "You're exactly the kind of person I need." Mark's mind raced. He had heard of Eleanor Brooks before, but only in whispers. She was a woman of immense wealth and power, but this was something entirely different. He could pay off his father's debts, secure a future for himself and his mother, but at what cost? "I need time to think," he finally said, standing up and pushing his chair back. Eleanor nodded, unfazed. "Of course, take all the time you need. But don't take too long. This offer won't last forever." Mark walked out of the bistro, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to think, but deep down, he knew he was running out of options. He could hardly deny that the idea of financial security was tempting, but marrying a stranger, was it worth the price? Little did Mark know, this offer would lead him down a path that would not only change his financial future but also challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and himself. Now, let's get back to our story. Mark stood outside the bistro, rain still pouring down as the city lights glowed through the mist. His mind was racing, torn between his desperate need for financial security and the uncertainty of this strange proposal. Was this really happening? Could he really marry a stranger for money? As the heavy raindrops drummed against the pavement, Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to make it on his own. But here he was, standing on the edge of a decision that could change his life forever. Mark walked home slowly, his mind clouded with doubt. He passed by the small apartment he shared with his mother, the faded "For Rent" sign hanging in the window, a reminder of the financial troubles they had been facing ever since his father's passing. His mother had always been supportive, but Mark knew she was exhausted by the constant struggle. He wanted to help her, to give her a life free from worry, but the weight of his own dreams seemed to crush him at every turn. As Mark entered their cramped apartment, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her tired eyes scanning a pile of bills. She looked up when he came in, offering him a weary smile. "How was work?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "It was fine," Mark replied, forcing a smile as he tried to push the thoughts of the bistro out of his mind. "Just the usual." His mother didn't seem convinced. She had always known when something was bothering him, but she didn't press. Instead, she changed the subject. "I got a call from the landlord today. He says we're behind on rent again." Mark's stomach dropped. He had hoped that somehow they would make it through this month, but now it seemed inevitable that they would be evicted. "I'll figure something out," he said, his voice tight with frustration. His mother nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Mark's heart ache. She had always been there for him, working multiple jobs to make ends meet, but he knew she couldn't keep doing it forever. Later that night, Mark lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. "Marry me," she had said. "It's a business arrangement." He couldn't shake the image of her face, so composed, so confident. She had offered him everything he needed: financial security, freedom from his father's debts, a chance to start fresh. But at what cost? He thought about what his mother had said. "I got a call from the landlord today." She didn't need to say anything more. He knew exactly what it meant. He needed to make a choice, and he needed to make it fast. Eleanor's offer had come at the perfect time, but it felt wrong. A part of him hated the idea of marrying someone for money, especially someone as cold and calculating as Eleanor. But another part of him, the part that had watched his mother struggle for years, couldn't deny that this could be the solution they both needed. He could pay off the debts, keep their home, and give his mother the life she deserved. It was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. The next morning, Mark called Eleanor. His hands trembled as he dialed her number, the decision weighing heavily on his chest. When she answered, her voice was calm, almost expectant. "Mark," she said, as though she had been waiting for him to call. "Have you made your decision?" Mark hesitated for a moment, the words sticking in his throat. He had never imagined that his life would come to this. "Yes," he finally said, his voice steady. "I'll do it." Eleanor's response was immediate, almost too calm. "Good. I'll have my lawyer draw up the contract. We'll meet later this week to finalize everything." As Mark hung up the phone, a mix of emotions flooded over him. He had made the choice. He had chosen stability, security, and the chance to build a better future. But a part of him felt like he had sold out, like he was giving up a piece of himself for something that seemed too good to be true. Later that week, Mark met Eleanor again, this time in her luxurious office. The contrast between their worlds was stark. Eleanor's polished, cold demeanor in the grand, sleek office reflected her wealth and power, while Mark felt out of place in his worn-out clothes and scruffy hair. He sat across from her, his palms sweating as she handed him the contract. "This is everything you need," she said, her voice businesslike. "Once you sign, we'll move forward. You'll have your debts cleared, and we can begin our arrangement." Mark took a deep breath, looking down at the paper in front of him. It was all so clinical, so impersonal. But he knew he had no choice. He signed the contract, his hand trembling slightly as he did so. Eleanor's eyes flickered over the contract briefly before she looked up at him. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice smooth and indifferent. As Mark left her office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The weight of the contract he had just signed settled heavily in his chest. He had made his choice, but he wasn't sure if it was the right one. What had he just agreed to? And more importantly, what would this mean for his future? Now, let's get back to our story. Mark sat in his small apartment, staring at the contract in front of him. It had been 3 days since he signed the deal with Eleanor, and now everything felt like it was moving too fast. The papers, the promises, the future he had just committed, one of it felt real. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. The decision had been made, but now he couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing, something important that he hadn't considered. His mother was out at work, and for the first time in a long while, Mark had the apartment to himself. The silence was deafening, and the weight of his decision seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the rain-soaked streets below. People were rushing by, lost in their own worlds, and for a brief moment, Mark felt like he was the only one left in the city. Was this really what he wanted? Was he willing to trade his independence for a life of luxury and security, even if it meant marrying a stranger? He had known that Eleanor was powerful and wealthy, but he hadn't realized how quickly he would be thrust into her world. His heart was still heavy with the thought of what he had given up. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Eleanor, a simple line of text: "Meeting tomorrow at my office. Come prepared." Mark stared at the message, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had been avoiding her, trying to figure out how to navigate this strange arrangement, but now it seemed like he had no choice but to face it head-on. The next day, Mark arrived at Eleanor's office building. The towering skyscraper loomed above him, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the gray sky. As he walked through the revolving doors, he couldn't help but feel small and out of place. The lobby was pristine, marble floors gleaming under the bright lights, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and fresh coffee. He approached the elevator, his nerves starting to kick in. When the doors opened to the top floor, Mark stepped out into a sleek, modern office space. Eleanor was waiting for him, sitting behind a polished mahogany desk. She didn't even look up as he walked in, her eyes fixed on a stack of papers in front of her. "Sit down, Mark," she said, her tone as businesslike as ever. "We need to discuss the next steps." Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her, his palms sweaty. He had expected a confrontation, or at least some form of explanation, but Eleanor didn't seem to be in any hurry to talk about their agreement. Instead, she handed him a folder, its contents sealed tightly in a manila envelope. "This is the next phase of the contract," Eleanor said, her voice cold and controlled. "I expect you to follow through. You will accompany me to a charity gala next week. There will be press, important people. It's crucial that we present ourselves as a couple, as part of this arrangement." Mark's mind raced as he looked down at the papers in the folder. The gala. The press. Everything was moving faster than he had imagined. He had no experience with this kind of world glamour, wealth, power. His life had always been simple, even if it had been filled with hardship. Now, he was being thrust into a spotlight he wasn't sure he was ready for. "You'll need to get fitted for a suit," Eleanor continued, her gaze never leaving the papers on her desk. "And we will need to act like a couple, Mark. No mistakes. This is not just about appearances. It's about securing our future." Mark nodded silently, unable to find the right words. His stomach churned as he thought about the kind of life he was about to step into. It wasn't just the money, it was the world of privilege, of people who had everything and still wanted more. Could he really fit into that world? Could he pretend to be someone he wasn't, even for a short time? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about his mother. It was about securing their future, about finally breaking free from the chains of his father's debts. Maybe it wasn't ideal, but it was the only option he had left. As he left Eleanor's office that day, the weight of the upcoming gala loomed over him. It felt like a dream, a nightmare, something that didn't belong in his world. He had signed the contract, yes, but now it felt like he was signing away more than just his freedom. He was signing away his identity, his sense of self. Was it worth it? Could he ever truly walk away from the man he used to be? The answers didn't come easily. But as Mark stood on the busy sidewalk, watching people rush by, he knew one thing for sure: his life had already changed, and there was no turning back now. Now, let's get back to our story. The days leading up to the charity gala felt like a blur to Mark. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, and each moment felt like it carried more weight than the last. He had never imagined himself in this world of wealth, power, and expectation. Yet, here he was, preparing to step into the very heart of it. Eleanor had insisted he get a suit, one that would fit him perfectly, one that would make him look like he belonged by her side. As he walked into the store, the luxury of it all felt suffocating. He was used to buying second-hand clothes from thrift shops, never having much money for things that weren't necessary. But now, standing in front of a mirror, dressed in a custom-tailored suit, he barely recognized himself. The tailor adjusted his collar, nodding in approval as Mark's reflection stared back at him, sharp, polished, and entirely foreign. "You look perfect, Mr. Davis," the tailor said with a smile. But Mark barely heard him. His thoughts were elsewhere. He felt out of place in this suit, in this world. How could he pretend to be someone he wasn't? He could hardly look himself in the mirror. But then, the thought of his mother, of the debts piling up, pushed him forward. He had no choice. This was the life he had agreed to. The life Eleanor had promised him. The night of the gala arrived, and Mark stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, staring at the man he had become, someone who barely resembled the man he used to be. His heart pounded in his chest, the anxiety making his palms sweat. He couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor and how he had barely known her before agreeing to marry her. He had signed the contract, but now, in the glow of the city lights, he wasn't sure what to expect. Would this night change everything? Would he finally find a way to fit in, or would he remain the outsider he had always been? At 7 p.m. sharp, the car Eleanor had arranged for him pulled up outside the apartment. Mark took one last look at himself in the mirror before stepping outside. He walked to the car, his heart racing with every step. Eleanor was already inside, waiting for him. When he got in, she barely glanced at him. Her focus was on her phone, typing out a message as if nothing were different. "We'll be arriving shortly," she said without looking up. "Remember, tonight is about appearances. Stick to the script, and everything will go smoothly." The drive to the gala was silent, and Mark couldn't help but feel like a passenger in his own life. He looked out of the window at the city passing by, the tall buildings gleaming under the night sky. It was all so different from what he knew. The car finally pulled up in front of the Venuan extravagant hotel with massive pillars, a red carpet rolled out in front. Mark's breath caught in his throat. This was the world he had been thrust into. He had never seen anything like it. The glitz, the glamour, the people in designer dresses and tuxedos, it was like stepping into a dream, a world where he didn't belong. Eleanor stepped out of the car first, graceful and confident as always. Mark followed behind her, trying his best to match her pace. He was acutely aware of every eye that turned to look at them as they walked up the red carpet. He felt like a fish out of water, but he kept his head high, reminding himself that he had no choice. This was the life he had signed up for. As they entered the ballroom, the lights dimmed, and the buzz of conversation filled the air. Mark felt like he was being swallowed by the crowd. Eleanor, on the other hand, moved effortlessly through the sea of people, greeting guests, shaking hands, and exchanging pleasantries. She was in her element, and Mark was left to follow her lead. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him every time they made eye contact, reminding him that tonight was not just about appearance, it was about proving that they were the perfect couple, a power move that would secure both their futures. Mark stood by her side as the night went on, trying to keep up with the fast-paced conversation around him. He felt like an actor in a play he didn't know the script to. As the night dragged on, the pressure to fit in grew heavier. But the more he watched Eleanor work the room, the more he realized how much he was just a pawn in her game. He wasn't here because she cared about him. He was here to fulfill his part of the contracto, act like her husband, to play the role she needed him to play. It wasn't until the charity auction that things started to shift. As the auctioneer began his rapid-fire calls, Eleanor was drawn into a conversation with some business associates, leaving Mark standing alone by the bar. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with questions. What was he really doing here? Was he simply a stepping stone for Eleanor's rise to power? And more importantly, what did he want out of this life? As Mark stood there, lost in thought, a woman approached him. She was dressed in a stunning black gown, her eyes bright and welcoming. "You look a little out of place," she said with a warm smile. "First time at a gala like this?" Mark turned to her, a little taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to speak to him so casually, let alone someone who looked so out of place in this crowd. "Yeah," he replied with a small laugh. "I'm just trying to keep up." The woman laughed softly. "Well, you're doing better than you think." As they talked, Mark felt a small spark of connection, something he hadn't felt all night. It was a brief moment of relief, a small escape from the world Eleanor had thrust him into. For the first time that evening, he didn't feel like a stranger. "Now, let's get back to our story." Mark stood at the bar, a glass of wine in his hand, feeling a mixture of tension and confusion. The night had already taken an unexpected turn. The woman who had approached him earlier was no longer in sight, and he found himself drifting in the sea of strangers once more. Eleanor was still engrossed in conversation with her business associates, a figure of confidence and control. Mark couldn't help but wonder how much of this was real. Was she truly this composed, or was it all just an act? The more he watched her, the more he realized that he was just another part of her carefully crafted world, a world he didn't belong in. He took a sip of his wine, trying to calm his nerves, when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around and saw a man dressed in an immaculate tuxedo, a friendly smile on his face. "Mark, right?" the man said, extending his hand. "I'm William, I've heard a lot about you." Mark hesitated for a moment before shaking the man's hand. Nice to meet you," he said, still feeling out of place. "I'm not sure what you've heard, though." William chuckled. "Don't worry, nothing bad, I assure you. Eleanor's told me a lot about you. It's good to finally meet the man she's chosen to, well, you know." Mark's stomach tightened. "Chosen?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He had never thought of it that way. Eleanor had never given him the impression that he was anything more than a means to an end. William seemed to pick up on his discomfort and quickly added, "I mean, of course, it's all for business, but she's a woman of her word. She's got a plan, and I admire that." Mark nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. He had never been a part of this world, the world of high-powered deals and wealth, and he certainly didn't feel like he belonged. Eleanor had brought him here, but for what? To play the role of a husband in a business arrangement? Was this really the life he wanted? As the night wore on, Mark found himself growing increasingly restless. The chatter around him was like background noise, meaningless and shallow. He glanced over at Eleanor, who was still surrounded by her circle, laughing and talking as if the world revolved around her. It was hard to tell if he was more annoyed with her or with himself. She had made it clear from the start that this was just a business arrangement, yet somewhere deep down, Mark had hoped that it could be more. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, something real could come out of this. But now, standing in the midst of all this wealth and power, he realized how foolish that hope had been. Suddenly, the music shifted, and Eleanor's voice cut through the air. She was making her way across the ballroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Mark turned to look at her, his heart skipping a beat. She caught his gaze, and for the briefest of moments, something flickered in her eyes, an expression that seemed almost vulnerable. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by her usual composed demeanor. "Mark," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "It's time. Follow my lead, and we'll make our entrance." Mark's heart raced as he followed her to the center of the ballroom. All eyes were on them as they took their place at the front of the room. Mark could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This wasn't just a charity event. This was a performance, and he was the actor playing a role he wasn't sure he could pull off. As the evening went on, Mark continued to feel like an outsider in a world that didn't belong to him. He smiled when he was supposed to, nodded when the conversation required it, but inside, he felt a growing sense of emptiness. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed to thrive. She moved through the crowd with ease, her charm and charisma making her the center of attention wherever she went. Mark had always admired her from a distance, but now he couldn't help but wonder if she was just as lonely as he was. Behind all her confidence and control, was there a woman who, too, was searching for something more? By the time the night came to a close, Mark was exhausted physically and emotionally. He had spent the entire evening pretending, trying to fit into a life he wasn't sure he wanted. And yet, as he followed Eleanor out of the ballroom, he felt something shift inside him. He had agreed to this arrangement for a reason. But as they made their way back to the car, Mark realized that he wasn't just following her anymore. He was beginning to wonder if this life, this world, was something he could embrace. But could he ever truly be a part of it, or was he destined to remain a stranger in a world that wasn't his own? Now, let's get back to our story. As the days passed after the gala, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The night had been a turning point, not just in his relationship with Eleanor, but in how he viewed his place in the world. The weight of his decision, the one he had made to marry her for financial security, felt heavier than ever, yet the uncertainty that had clouded his mind before seemed to have lifted, if only for a moment. The question now was, what came next? He had spent the past few days in a daze, trying to focus on his studies and his part-time job, but everything felt distant. His thoughts kept drifting back to Eleanor, to the way she moved through her world with such ease and confidence. He had seen glimpses of vulnerability in her that night at the gala, but they were fleeting. She had always been so composed, so controlled, and it left Mark wondering, was she truly as untouchable as she seemed, or was there more to her story than she was letting on? One afternoon, as he sat in the small cafe near his apartment, Mark received a call from Eleanor. Her voice was calm, but there was a tone in it that Mark had learned to recognize, a tone that meant she had something important to discuss. "Mark," she said, "I need you to meet me at my office today. There's something we need to go over." Mark's stomach tightened. He had hoped that things would settle into some kind of routine, but now it seemed that there was always something new for him to navigate. "I'll be there," he said, hanging up before he could think of what else to say. When Mark arrived at her office, Eleanor was waiting for him, as poised and composed as ever. She motioned for him to sit down as she went over some papers on her desk. Mark couldn't help but feel out of place in this sleek, polished environment. It was so different from the life he had known, and yet, it felt like it was becoming his reality. "There's a board meeting next week," Eleanor began without looking up from her papers. "I need you to attend with me. You'll be introduced as my husband, and you'll need to play the part. It's important that we make an impression." Mark nodded, trying to keep his composure, though inside he was once again questioning his decision. Was this really what he had signed up for? A life of pretending, of keeping up appearances? He wasn't sure how much more he could take, but the truth was, he had no choice. Eleanor was counting on him, and he had promised to follow through. "Of course," he said quietly, his voice betraying none of his doubts. "I'll be there." As the week dragged on, Mark found himself caught between his growing frustration and the pull of his responsibilities. The more time he spent with Eleanor, the more he saw how calculated she was. It wasn't just about business, it was about control. She had built her empire with precision, and now, she was doing the same with their relationship. Mark had never thought of himself as a pawn in someone else's game, but the more he observed her, the more he felt like that was exactly what he was becoming. On the day of the board meeting, Mark felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach as he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his suit for the third time. He couldn't remember the last time he had worn something so expensive, and the realization that he was about to sit in a room full of powerful people only made him feel more out of place. But he had promised Eleanor he would play the part, and so he did. When they arrived at the meeting, the room was full of well-dressed executives, all deep in conversation. As soon as Eleanor entered, the room quieted, and all eyes turned to her. Mark followed behind her, his heart racing as they approached the front. Eleanor's presence seemed to command attention without her having to say a word. Mark stood beside her, trying to stay calm as she introduced him to the room. "This is my husband, Mark Davis," Eleanor said smoothly, her tone flawless. "We are excited to be working together on our latest ventures." Mark nodded politely, offering a smile to the group, but inside, he felt as if the world had shifted around him. He was a part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined, and for the first time since signing the contract, he wondered what would become of him in this world. Was he truly just a tool in Eleanor's game, or was there more to this arrangement than he had realized? Throughout the meeting, Mark remained mostly silent, observing as Eleanor expertly navigated the discussions, her confidence never wavering. She spoke with authority, answering questions and offering solutions with ease. Mark had always respected her, but now he was starting to understand the full extent of her power. She wasn't just a woman in a man's world. She had created her own world, one that was entirely under her control. As the meeting wrapped up, Eleanor turned to Mark with a small, approving smile. "You did well," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of praise. "I knew you could handle it." Mark forced a smile, but inside, he was wrestling with a growing sense of unease. He had kept his promise. He had played the part. But as he left the meeting room, he couldn't help but feel like he was losing himself. The man he used to be, an ambitious student with a dream of making his own way, felt like a distant memory. In his place, there was a man trying to survive in a world that wasn't his own, clinging to the remnants of a life he had never truly wanted. Now, let's get back to our story. Mark sat in his small apartment, staring at the contract once again, his mind swirling with doubt and frustration. The world he had entered felt like a maze, each turn leading him deeper into a life he hadn't asked for. Eleanor had been distant lately, and as much as he hated to admit it, he was starting to feel the weight of the choices he had made. The promise of financial security, the hope of a better future for his mother, all of it seemed to be slipping away as he wondered if it had ever been worth it. The truth was, Mark didn't feel like himself anymore. He had spent the past few weeks pretending, playing the role of a husband to a woman who treated him like an accessory, a pawn in a game she was far too skilled at playing. He couldn't remember the last time they had shared a real conversation, a moment of connection that wasn't about business or appearances. Every time they interacted, it felt like he was just one more piece in her well-crafted world, nothing more than a convenient part of the arrangement. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. He looked down at the screen and saw Eleanor's name flash across it. She had been calling more frequently lately, but each conversation had been short, businesslike, and impersonal. Still, something about this call felt different. With a sigh, he answered. "Mark," Eleanor's voice came through the phone, calm and composed as always. "We need to talk. There's a change of plans for the upcoming charity event. I need you to attend with me, but this time, it's different. We'll need to be more public about our relationship. I want people to see us as a power couple. This is the next step." Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The pressure was mounting. Everything had been moving at a pace he couldn't keep up with, and now, Eleanor was asking him to take things to a whole new level. A power couple? He had barely gotten used to pretending to be her husband, now she wanted to turn their arrangement into something bigger, more public, more real. "What do you mean by more public?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck as the weight of her words settled in. "I mean that we'll need to show the world that this is a real marriage," she explained, her voice steady. "We'll need to show affection, act like a couple in front of others. People need to believe in us." Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had always known that Eleanor was a force to be reckoned with, but this felt like a step too far. He had agreed to the arrangement, yes, but the more he learned about her world, the more he realized how little control he had over his own life. "I don't know if I can do that," Mark said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. He had never wanted to be a part of a fake relationship, especially not one that would be on display for the world to see. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Eleanor spoke again, her voice colder now. "You agreed to this, Mark. You signed the contract. There's no turning back. I'm doing what's necessary for both of us. You're not alone in this." Mark's stomach churned at her words. He had agreed to the contract, but the reality of it was starting to feel suffocating. He had never imagined he would be asked to play a role so convincingly, so publicly. And yet, here he was, standing on the edge of something he couldn't control. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely audible, almost as if he were convincing himself more than agreeing with her. "I'll do what you need. But after this I need to talk. I need to know where this is going." "Of course," Eleanor replied, her tone softening slightly. "We'll talk soon. But for now, get ready. This is important." As he hung up the phone, Mark sat in silence for a long moment. His head was spinning. He had no idea what was happening anymore. The line between what was real and what was fake was blurring, and he didn't know how to stop it. He had promised to do whatever it took, but what was it all for? Was this the life he wanted? Or had he already lost himself in the process? He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The lights seemed so far away, so distant from the life he had once dreamed of. Was he really going to continue living this way? Was this really the future he had chosen for himself? The thoughts weighed heavily on him, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had the answers anymore. The contract, the role he had agreed to play, it all felt like it was slipping through his fingers. But it was too late to back out now. Or was it? Now, let's get back to our story. The following day, Mark was standing in front of the mirror again, this time in a hotel suite that Eleanor had arranged for him. The charity gala was only a few hours away, and everything felt like it was moving in fast forward. He had no time to think about what he was really doing, only had to follow the plan. Eleanor's instructions had been clear: look like a couple, act like a couple, and most importantly, make the world believe they were exactly what they were pretending to be. As he adjusted his tie, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This was no longer just about playing a role, it was becoming his reality. The walls he had carefully built around himself, the ones that kept him grounded in his own sense of identity, were slowly crumbling. Eleanor's world was swallowing him whole, and he wasn't sure if he could keep pretending much longer. Mark's phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Eleanor, as always, brief and to the point: "Meet me downstairs in 15 minutes. Be ready." He stared at the screen for a moment, wondering if he could back out now. But he knew the answer. He had already committed, and there was no turning back. He had to go through with it. He had to be the husband she needed him to be. When he arrived downstairs, Eleanor was waiting for him in the hotel lobby, her presence as commanding as ever. She looked perfect, every detail of her outfit meticulously chosen, her expression one of quiet confidence. Mark, in his freshly tailored suit, felt like a shadow beside her. "You look good," Eleanor said, her eyes scanning him briefly. "Let's make sure the world sees it too." She turned on her heel and walked toward the waiting car, and Mark followed, trying to keep up. The drive to the gala felt like the longest journey Mark had ever taken. He could feel the tension building in his chest as they approached the venue. The lights of the city flashed past, but his mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together the mess of emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to be done with this. He wanted to leave the charade behind. But there was something else, something deep down, that kept him tethered to Eleanor, to the promise he had made. As they arrived, the red carpet was already rolled out, and the flashing lights of cameras greeted them. Mark's stomach churned. This was the moment that would define everything. He glanced at Eleanor, but she was already moving with purpose, her focus locked on the crowd ahead. Stay close, she instructed, her voice steady as they stepped out of the car. Mark nodded, falling into step behind her. The crowd's chatter quieted as they made their way inside. Eleanor's hand brushed his arm, a gesture that, to anyone else, would have looked like affection. But to Mark, it felt like a performancia carefully rehearsed act. Inside, the ballroom was grander than anything Mark had ever seen. The chandeliers sparkled above, and the floor was filled with people in expensive gowns and tuxedos, all of them laughing, networking, and exchanging pleasantries. It was a world of wealth and power, and Mark felt like a stranger. Eleanor, however, moved through it like she belonged, greeting people, shaking hands, and drawing attention to herself with every step. As they approached a table where several guests were gathered, Eleanor introduced Mark with the same smooth, practiced words she had used before. "This is my husband, Mark," she said, her voice warm yet professional. Mark smiled, his heart pounding in his chest as he shook hands with people he had never met. He smiled when he was supposed to, nodded when the conversation turned his way, but inside, he felt like an actor, playing a part he hadn't fully memorized. The night passed in a blur of faces and flashing cameras. Mark could barely keep up with the conversations, the compliments, the glances that seemed to measure him up. Every moment felt like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't quite reach. Eleanor was in her element, but Mark felt more out of place than ever. Later, as the night wound down and the guests began to filter out, Eleanor pulled Mark aside, her expression unreadable. "You did well," she said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. "This is exactly what we needed." Mark felt a mix of relief and confusion. He had done what she asked, but the emptiness inside him remained. He had played the role, but at what cost? He had come this far, but he was beginning to wonder if he could keep up the act. Was he fooling the world, or was he just fooling himself? As they left the venue, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He had promised Eleanor that he would follow through, but now, with the night behind him, he wasn't sure what that promise meant anymore. What had started as a simple business arrangement was starting to feel more like a trap. Now, let's get back to our story. Mark had always believed in making his own way. He had worked hard for everything he had, and the idea of relying on someone else, especially someone like Eleanor, had always seemed impossible. But now, after everything he had been through, after the constant juggling between his real life and the life he was pretending to live, he began to realize something. The world he had stepped into was not just a business arrangement, it was a life, one that was starting to shape his future in ways he hadn't expected. It had been a few weeks since the gala, and the pressure had only mounted. Eleanor's expectations of him were clear, and the demands she placed on their relationship had become even more intense. She wanted him by her side at every major event, every meeting, every public appearance. Mark had learned to play the role, to smile and nod, to pretend that everything was perfect. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was living a lie. One afternoon, as he sat at home, the phone rang. It was Eleanor again. She had become a constant presence in his life, one he couldn't avoid even if he wanted to. "Mark," she said, her voice cold as always, "I need to talk to you. There's something important we need to discuss." Mark's heart sank. He had learned to dread these calls. He knew they were never good news, never anything simple. "What is it?" he asked, his voice filled with resignation. "We need to have a conversation about the future," Eleanor continued, her tone neutral. "You're not just my husband in name anymore, Mark. You're part of my legacy now. This is no longer just about us. It's about everything I've built. And if you're not prepared to follow through, we need to talk about what comes next." Mark felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had known this moment would come, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. The reality of what he had agreed to, of what he had become a part of, was finally hitting him. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement anymore. This was his life. Whether he liked it or not, he had chosen this path. Or, more accurately, he had been swept into it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, his voice a little more controlled now. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answer. Eleanor's voice softened, just slightly, but it didn't offer the comfort he had hoped for. I'm saying that we need to decide what's next, Mark. I'm ready to take this to the next level. But I can't do it alone. I need you to be fully invested, or we can end this now. The words hit him like a wave, and for a moment, Mark was speechless. What did it mean to be fully invested in this life? What did it mean to be part of Eleanor's world? He had signed the contract, yes, but at what cost? The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Mark spoke again, his voice quieter this time. And if I'm not ready? There was no hesitation in Eleanor's response. Then we end it. Simple as that. Mark sat back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand. He had spent so long trying to make sense of this life, this world that he had been thrust into. And now, Eleanor was giving him an ultimatum. She had always been in control, and now, she was asking him to make a choice, one that could define the rest of his life. In that moment, Mark realized something. He had been so focused on the future, on the promises Eleanor had made, that he had forgotten to consider what he really wanted. Was he willing to continue down this path, to live a life dictated by someone else's rules? Or was it time to walk away and reclaim the life he had once dreamed of? The decision weighed heavily on him, but Mark knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep living a lie. It was time to choose his own path. As the days went by, Mark's thoughts became clearer. He knew what he had to do. He had to take control of his own future, even if it meant walking away from the life Eleanor had offered him. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way he could find peace. In the end, Mark made his choice. He walked into Eleanor's office, his mind made up, and told her the truth was leaving. No more pretending, no more playing the part of a man he wasn't. He was going to rebuild his life, one step at a time, starting with the truth. As he left her office, Mark felt a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the first step toward reclaiming the life he had almost lost. Now, let's get back to our story.